I want to be a lawyer. Damn, it looks pretty easy. You just never answer anything. Oh, attorney-client privilege. Oh, man. Good morning. 8:48. Let's get right to it. She is... I'm going to call her the corrector. Mary Rhodes.
Hi, Mary.
Have you watched that hearing yesterday? And I know you were in it, Mary, but when the governor's legal counsel, and they've been saying this, and I know you addressed it on the show.
Let me just read it first, right?
Okay,
Because this is the chronology that was in the governor's statement that High-Hen read, and he didn't read the whole thing, but on March 17th, 2020, he read, "It was discovered that Homeland Security Advisor had not procured quarantine or isolation facilities as previously reported. Homeland Security's reliance on condemning a certain hotel was not approved. Legal counsel was instructed to and quickly engaged with Guam Hotel and Restaurant Association, GHRA, to seek hotel properties willing to serve as quarantine sites. GHRA was later able to report that only the Days Inn, Wyndham Garden, Santa Fe, Perlis Court, and Pacific Star responded. All those facilities were ultimately utilized." So, Mary, fact or fiction?
Only part fact.
What's the percentage, Mary? 60-40?
It's 60%. Because at that time on that date, none of them had confirmed yet. So what I explained to everybody, or let me just stay on this topic. So with those 5 hotels, only Days Inn, Wyndham had been contacted, and we met with once at the Homeland Security Office Advisor's office with Sophia Diaz, legal counsel Hai-Hoon, and Tim Uggan, and myself met with the Days Inn and Wyndham. We also met with Cortec, but they did not agree on terms, and so those were the only meetings I was a part of. I did not participate in any other meeting with any of the hotels afterwards. And so the information GHRA collected, which is really our only role in this, is collecting information on behalf of our membership, was to provide the information back to those individuals, including the chief of staff. So the reason why I say 60% is because only Days Inn and Wyndham were collected, as well as Hotel Santa Fe. And I know that through the FOIA request, you have since received copies of the emails where I provided that via email to them. Now, with that information, what they did afterwards was continue to meet with them so that they can agree on terms, and I was not involved in any meeting outside of the initial meeting. The reason why I'm saying the other 40% are incorrect is because Pacific Star and Perlis Court didn't happen until probably even days later, if not even weeks later, with Perlis Court. And Perlis Court is not a member of GHRA, so I was nowhere affiliated, or even I wouldn't even know who to call to contact Perlis Court. Pacific Star did come online, though, by sending a request to GHRA to participate after March 19th, and we provided that information to legal counsel, Tim Uggan, and the chief of staff at the time, Tony Babauta.
Mary, it kind of seemed like they were really trying to piggyback off your credibility in GHRA and dropping that statement out there like, hey, no, GHRA was cool with all this. Mm-hmm. And is that what prompted you to jump into this?
Yeah,
this
how
meeting?
did that happen? Because you weren't on the original list, or the list that I got that was confirmed to participate in the oversight hearing, and then all of a sudden you came on. How did that happen?
Yeah, let me tell you, Mary, when you came on, everyone was like, oh, what?
Oh, crap.
Oh, man, what? Oh, look out. No, you did.
Actually, from now on, that's the feeling I've gotten for the last 14 years I've been at GHRA every time I enter the legislature. There's like a deep exhale in breathing. And I'll tell you, even Congressman Mike Nicholas, even past Senator PJ Cruz, the OPA auditor, they would always be like, oh, Mary's here. And they literally would put me at the end. because they know, I've always been lengthy and I'll provide all the details, but I don't always attend sessions. But the sessions I do attend, I am there for a purpose. Mm-hmm. And so I am choosy. I do pick which ones I am vocal on.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the tourism industry, or specifically to our role as GHRA, then I'll be there. And even though I was not invited, which is kind of odd considering that the government did reach out to engage with GHRA initially, it was interesting I was not included in that list. But I did reach out to some senators saying that I wanted to get in because I had already received an inquiry from a media person of why am I not there since I've been mentioned so many times.
Mary, we had a comment here on Facebook from Andrew. You've got a target on your back.
No, I don't think it's a target. GHRA has always played a very crucial role in the community, and nothing in that I said actually was disparaging to anybody.
Right.
I think I set the record clear, but also I also stated, quarantine did not happen just at the onset of mandatory quarantine going into effect. I very clearly stated we were already on quarantine facilities well before, in January with Linda DeNorsi.
Correct.
And we held pandemic workshops to explain quarantine and the protocols to take. It's part of our pandemic plan. So none of this anybody should be, I guess, worried about to talk about. Linda DeNorsi did speak about it quite in detail. And then I gave them the real timeline, which started in January when we started our pandemic workshops to get the hotels ready to start addressing quarantine, because the quarantine, the mandatory effect did not have to really just take place because you would have to quarantine anyway if a tourist would have to show any signs, and public health has to come on site, whether it's a public health facility, a clinic, or a hotel or a house.
Mary, so
we would just initiate that.
I think any reasonable person who's listening to what you were saying now and listen to what you said last night, I mean, the argument from Carlo Branch and the legal counsel Hai Hun was that we didn't have a week. But like we said earlier on the show, if you were saying that we're looking at facilities since January and COVID-19 was the headline around the world, I mean, it's either A, you guys didn't act quick enough, or B, if we were looking at facilities since January, is it really our fault that you didn't do something to secure them sooner?
Yeah, well, we were following our plan, right, with public health. And I that is our responsibility during a pandemic or during an emergency, is to look at non-congregate shelter for mass shelter in place, or just any lodging concerns on how to handle it. So I think that we were doing our part in January, especially with public health and all the agencies that were involved when we held several workshops to get the private sector ready in January and in February. And we did this also part and parcel with GVB, the airport authority, all the agencies were involved. So where this became an urgent matter was when in March, the week prior to mandatory quarantine effect taking place, and this is where Senator Therese Terlahi identified that even prior to the executive order, we already started asking, okay, since we had gotten no's from all the hotels who responded to our survey, they said they would do quarantine on floors, but not necessarily the entire hotel. Mm-hmm. So we had to reach out to everybody, and only Days Inn and Wyndham at that time, and then Santa Fe came in, said yes to our direct call inquiries, but they also did not respond yes initially to our survey. We had to place calls to the hotels who didn't respond yet.
Right. And
it was always just Days Inn, Wyndham, and Santa Fe. And if you look at the way they're handled, even today with the new contract procurement that did go through GSA, it's exactly how it's always been handled, which is where public health, National Guard, GPD, all staff it. And that is exactly how it was set up initially.
That's a far cry from what we saw with this first round of emergency, whatever, superpower buying, purchase, thingamabob. But
I want to ask.
If you look, it was actually maintained throughout the entire period at Days Inn and Wyndham.
Do you feel, though, you provided that timeline, all of the talks about quarantine facilities as part of pandemic planning began in January, and then to see this statement and for Mr. Hyun to read it, do you feel like this was intentional in terms of trying to make it seem like GHRA was totally involved, this was legit, to kind of...
Well, I think in his defense, he's only referring to the time frame of where this is being questioned and also the time frame in which he got involved. He was not involved. I had never talked to Hai prior to March 16th or 17th.
Right.
He was only brought in after the fact. I had been dealing with Tim Uggan from Homeland Security. And,
so what happened with
Tony.
What happened with Tim Uggan? Because it kind of seems like they threw him under the bus, and it's very convenient to throw the person who's not there under the bus.
I think you're going to have to ask Tim that. I think Tim was involved from the beginning, and then it kind of fell off. But I also fell off after the initial week in the getting the mandatory quarantine facilities in order. So once we did the initial meeting, I did not have any further conversation with the hotels. It was all in the hands of those agencies and with legal counsel at that point. And so I really can't speak to those matters, but definitely Tim was involved from the very beginning and then throughout that process. And especially when you're going through procurement and for emergencies, Homeland Security advisor, similar to what Charles Estevez said, it has to go through Homeland. And if you're going to work with FEMA, which I know that the Post quoted me today that, even FEMA with Office of Civil Defense, they're in the same building. And they have a lot of people who have years of experience, more than 10 years. Working with FEMA, and they're all right there in the same building.
At the end of the day, on these unsigned contracts, should it have been, because you see who's supposed to sign it? It was supposed to be Civil Defense Administrator, Civil Defense Certifying Officer, the Attorney General, the Governor, and BBMR. Should it have said Guam Homeland Security instead of Charles Estevez? Signing off on...
It's always supposed to start off with Homeland Security during an emergency.
So even the contract...
But
unsigned.
The challenge here in this is that it's a public health emergency, right? And that's why Homeland hasn't really been leading all of this in the way normally it should during an emergency. But I think that's where lessons learned are learned, is that regardless of public health or any kind of emergency, we always need to loop in Homeland Security and Office of Civil Defense if we're going to seek any federal reimbursement.
Right, Mary.
And that occurred the second time around.
The right way. But I think it's
Again,
also
we learn.
You're right. It's also important to note that they were trying to run it through the FEMA reimbursement route, but they hit a roadblock when people were like, "I'm not signing that." Nope. And you had Claudia Kfaji saying, "I didn't want to get involved with a mess that I didn't know about." And so one of the things that just really gets to me is we see this hearing, and it's like everybody seems to know how we do the emergency procurement during an emergency, except for Adelup.
Yeah, but even at that, even when you go into a situation where, she does have those Title 10 powers to get those reimbursements, you can still provide the supporting documents to see if the federal government will still be take those as allowable charges. So even if they're not willing to sign it, I think that if you provide them with that documentation and justify it, then you could still try to seek that reimbursement. And I would think that they would still, if they're saying that this was authorized during an emergency, then I think they need to just continue down that path to seek that reimbursement, considering that she did have the right to execute those powers. So the fact that we're using CARES Act, at the end of the day, I think that everybody's kind of learning through this, and it was a fluid process. But regardless, I was happy to hear. I did ask one of my last questions is, everybody acted in good faith. The rates were actually even reduced to an amount that I know was more acceptable with the government, and I know that the documentation has been provided since then. And so my question was, it's not just the contracts with the hotels, it's also the other vendors.
Right.
It's all of the services that were provided. And I know that we've gone back to the initial model with Days Inn and Wyndham and Santa Fe to include only government agencies that provide those services, like for the military with National Guard and healthcare with public health at those facilities. So I'm just wondering, I asked the question if those services have all been rendered and then also paid for. And so I believe DOA confirmed that everything's been paid out. So
Right.
if everything's been paid out and documentation has all been provided to support those payments, then I think that there should be resolution in that.
Yeah, but I'm not clear on what documents were provided, because it kind of seems like the governor so ordered Ed Byrne, who's now in this, I think it's obvious Ed Byrne is in a difficult position. I mean, he's not normally a short-tempered guy, and he was kind of short with you last night.
Yeah, he didn't want me asking him a direct question, which, I can understand. I'm not the one running the hearing, but
Right.
as I said at the end, we're all taxpayers, and I think I was concerned more from the private sector side and making sure the hotels were indeed fairly compensated for the services that have already been rendered, because there are there are laws on Guam with regards to rendering services and the price that can be affixed to those services if there's not a contract. And that would be more expensive than the rate that they negotiated. And so that's already in Guam law, and it would put everybody in a precarious position even further if that wasn't placed in. So it was good to hear that those were provided, the payments to the outstanding invoices, but you're right. The FOIA request was very interesting in the fact that they only provided the initial documentation for how it was engaged in the beginning, but it didn't include any of the documents, the subsequent documents.
Right.
It only helped justify how we started with the engagement. And so I contacted Bree because I want to make sure that everybody knows that we weren't contracted to handle these services as far as GHRA.
Well, is that the story of the day or what? Because yesterday at that oversight hearing, Claudia Faggi was like, "Oh, not involved." Charles Esteves was like, "Oh, not involved. Nobody asked me the right way to do it." Now you're like, "Oh, not involved." But the AG's office is like, "We shall not disclose that."
Yeah, but that's where that collaboration, and I think that's where we all need to learn that it's not about staying in our silos and not saying, hey, this is not my lane or I'm not involved. I think that we need to all take a lesson in working together. And, then we won't have these kinds of problems. I think it is everybody's responsibilities to get involved. If you see or hear things that are not being procured properly or handled, we were having meetings at Homeland Security all of the time at the beginning. And, there was a big question of why it wasn't being run through the rack in a normal way.
So people were talking about this as it was happening.
Yeah, so I think that it's very unfortunate that the result ended in the way it did, but I think that even when you're in those positions, especially high-level positions, you need to get involved so that you can help the process rather than at the end distance yourself from it and say, I wasn't involved, so therefore I'm not in charge.
Yeah, but I think they were concerned about exposure. I mean, from what Claudia Faggi said, if they're already paying out invoices, and it's clear that Charles Esteves didn't want to sign this because I feel they would be exposed. He seems to know the
sure.
process.
There's
Yeah,
right?
So yeah, and I think that's so key, is that these people didn't want anything to do with this process. And so when they ran up against that roadblock, like we've been saying, they took it out of that lane for FEMA reimbursement, and then wham bam boo went into the superpowers highway.
Yeah, and the same thing with Linda, right? I mean,
So
Linda
the way
has
they
kinda stood her
describe
ground.
the way they describe it, Mary, is that they intended to use the superpowers all along, but that's not what happened. Because we followed the timeline of events. Sabrina has done a great job reporting on this procurement, and it's clear that they had tried to do it the regular way, but when the governor's legal counsel went out and negotiated all this stuff and then threw it over to Claudia Kvaji's lap, and Claudia found out that there were already electronic fund transfer payments made, she basically said last night, this isn't even procurement anymore. It's a done deal.
Yeah, but I'm not referencing Claudia
Yeah.
or Charles Esteves. I'm actually referencing between where it was already at, between the chief of staff, Tim Muggan, and legal counsel High.
Right.
Right? They were always included in the beginning with Linda, and all of that information was taking place, and the discussions were being had, and the meetings were taking place with the vendors. So they were all involved in that initial process.
Mm-hmm.
And then it fell to a wayside. So I think that that's where those agencies, those higher ups need to work together to get the right resources in place and the protocols in place. I'm not referencing Claudia or
Right.
Charles Esteves or Linda. I think that they've stood their ground, and I think, that's important,
Yeah.
of course, because they did do their jobs. But I think that that's a lesson for really just any senior management team when you know things are happening, that you finish the process. You don't just do hands off and say, hey, I'm not going to be involved because one person's handling it or whatever. Because it's falling onto legal counsel, but really was it his responsibility to finish that process too? So I'm just saying that all the right individuals were involved in the beginning, and I was part of that process. And then when
This was March 17th? Or do you remember?
Yes, it was started. Actually, we started with Homeland Security even a week prior.
Mm-hmm.
I was getting messages, I believe, March 12th already.
Was that
with regards to what did we secure?
right? March. Okay, so let's say it's March 12th. Was that Tony Babalta, HSA,
Tony and HSA Tim Muggan.
and not High?
No, not at all. I did not meet High in this process until after March 17th.
Okay, so
March 16th.
Okay, so it sounds like what happened was Tony Babalta and the HSA dropped the ball, and then High, the governor told High to come in and help with this process, but then he needed help, so he went and asked the AG for guidance, but didn't ask Civil Defense or GSA or anybody.
Maybe he did. We don't know. I think that.
Well, no, because
we know.
it was all screwed up.
Maybe it's just
I'm just saying we
inexperience,
don't know.
Mary. I mean,
We
I'm
don't
pretty
know
sure.
the background.
I'm pretty sure the legal counsel never been a lawyer at this level. I mean, this is a high level.
Mm-hmm.
We need a high level lawyer to do these kind of things, and I think it's pretty clear. I mean,
No, it's clear. It is clear that somebody screwed this up at the beginning, right? And it sounds like it was the HSA and Tony Babalta, and the governor tried to get. She told her legal counsel to come in here and help fix this, and he did, but he didn't know necessarily what he was doing. So,
well, to be fair, I think we were getting traction, but not fast enough for them, and we needed to secure hotels in order for the mandatory quarantine to go into place.
And
right?
that's the argument, right? But again, I want to go back to proactive instead of reactive. And you said already, you guys were looking at facilities. We knew COVID-19 was a thing. And there was that discussion when we had the positive cases leading up to that day. People out here in the community were saying, why aren't we doing anything about COVID-19?
Right.
Yeah.
So did we have enough time? You said it was well, I'm not sure if you said it, but we only had such a limited time when we wanted to implement these mandatory protocols because President Duterte was like, okay, everybody out, right? Did we not have enough time to get these quarantine facilities by following the proper emergency procurement protocols? Do you feel that we did based on your experience?
I can't speak for those agencies, but certainly for in the fact that we were already looking at facilities March 12th, and then we were, we were already confirming facilities starting March 12th, and then through March 16th, we were already getting traction on 2, if not 3, then that's really where those conversations on the contracting and the procurement should have taken place, which it seemed like it did, but it was handled differently.
Hey,
Mhm.
did you expect to go into that hearing and have to just be setting the record straight as many times as you did? You set high straight in the beginning. Carlo Branch, the policy director of
So I
Adelup.
didn't know what I was setting straight because I was not privy to the first part of the hearing.
Right.
I was actually on the Economic Advisory
Right.
Task Force conference call.
Yeah.
So I was a little late to it. Well, also I wasn't invited, but when I did get the call-in number from the senators, I was able to get on, and it was probably a good 40 minutes, I think,
Before
I
you
even spoke.
Yeah, I know.
But I did not hear their initial statements to even try to even speak to what they said.
Right.
I was just only testifying on what I knew and what I did.
Right, but in doing that, you contradicted what they had said earlier.
I didn't realize. I don't know what they said, and that wasn't the intent.
Yeah.
The intent was to provide a clear timeline and provide the information of how it happened.
Well, at least somebody provided a clear something.
So, again, we work together with the government, and so even for some people to say that, when people speak out, you have a target on your back, I don't think that that's where, honestly, we should operate from.
No, I think they're just saying that you spoke out and good for you. I don't think they mean it like, hey, watch your back. I think it's just a random Facebook comment. I think they're just saying that, hey, good job, because, it's clear a lot of people weren't saying much last night, and I feel like you asked better questions than some of these senators.
Oh, gosh.
They couldn't even stick around for the whole hearing.
Some of the, I'd like to say I have a good relationship with pretty much everybody, with media as well as the senators, and even with the agencies I work with. And I work with a lot of agencies when we advocate on behalf of GHRA and the tourism industry. And even in working with Hi and Tim and everybody else and Linda, I have to say, even in what I did provide in that information, I was texting back and forth with a couple of people, and they were comfortable with what I was saying because it was the truth. And even though I still provided clarification, which might have contradicted what was stated, maybe it didn't completely contradict everything, but it was providing clarity on everything. And that's all I can do is provide, really the truth.
Man, I love how you put that, providing clarity. I call it calling out BS.
And there was that part because, was it Carlo who mentioned something about, the Theodore Roosevelt, they didn't have a contract, but they paid out people, and then you jumped in, and I was like, oh no.
Yeah, I really texted them too. I'm like, I'm sorry to jump in, but that is such an incorrect statement, and that is not correct to do also, because those are completely different terms, different environment. We shouldn't be comparing it to the quarantine with Roosevelt. But it's just not a true statement in that we did have contracts. They are different kinds of contracts than what the government has, and this is directly with the U.S. Navy and Department of Defense.
But Mary,
so they're not comparable.
Think if you hadn't have been there, Carlo Branch would have just put out that nonsense and it would have flown. So I want to thank you for being there to call out that BS.
Yeah, I'm glad too.
Yeah.
Because, I'm responsible for not just GHRA, the organization, or anything that I do personally and professionally, but, somebody has to represent private sector here. Somebody has to represent the tourism industry for the other businesses who served as vendors. And that's why I kept saying it's more than just the hotel. There were other services that were approved in this. And why are the hotels only being the ones identified in how it happened? What about the rest of the services that were offered and rendered during this time? Everything should fall under the same, scrutiny, but at the same time, the same rules in how we pay these out. And so that's why that question was really important with DA, and I am glad that that's where it ended, because if in case this does fall under the Title 10, and that is what we're going to defend when we put it into the CARES Act or wherever, if we try to seek reimbursement for federal, then everything should fall under that umbrella, and then they just have to provide the documentation to get it supported. But it has to be all-inclusive. It can't just be about hotels. There's laundry vendors, there's meals vendors, there's improvements on hours spent by people, not just the executive people that served the cabinet members, but what about all of public health? Guam Army National Guard gets paid on this, police department, everything that was issued out. And so I think it's very important that everybody just complete the documentation, provide this all to the appropriate agencies, and move forward.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Mary.
You're welcome. I really appreciate all the time that you guys give, as well as, the other media, and I just appreciate the ones who did reach out to me, including the senators who reached out to me. I worked with, I texted, the chairwoman, Sabina Perez, as well as Therese and Senator Chalahi and Senator Tina Munoz Barnes, and even the speaker's staff, just to get on the call.
Right.
And so I'm so grateful that they provided the Zoom call information so that I could get online to clear the record.
Right.
Because, when we do public-private partnerships, we don't want to disparage anybody in the process, but we want to set the record clear because we have to continue to work together. But how we get through certain situations is really more important than what ends up happening, right? So I think it's very important that everybody kind of take this as a lesson learned, and on a going forward basis, things are more clear.
Right. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks, Mary.
All right, thank you,
Okay.
guys.
Wash your
Stay
hands.
safe.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Wow, Mary Rhodes. I really love hearing from Mary because she just tells it how it is. And I got to say, when I got the governor's letter from the legislature about her executive powers and why Hai and Sophia were going to virtually attend this public hearing, but just read the statement. When I read the statement, I may have got it like maybe 15 minutes before we were about to go on the news, and I had to rewrite the story based on that statement. And when I read the part about when Hai became involved, which again was, I think it was March 16th or 17th, and GHRA was mentioned, and it really did conflict with what Mary had told us in our interviews about how she was not involved with Pacific Star, and how Perlis Court was not even part of the GHRA.
Right, that's one I want to know more about, Perlis Court. How, if they're not a GHRA member, how do they even come into the conversation? And there's I don't know what kind of documentation we have on that.
No, there's an agreement.
Okay.
That was part of what the governor's office provided to Senator Sabina Perez. And in the information that they had provided her, it was a bunch of unsigned agreements. Perlis Court was one of them, and I believe that was signed by Bart Jackson. And I want to say, but it was signed on the same day. It was May 8th. That was the same day that the governor sent her memorandum citing her Title 10 authority and ordering Byrne to pay out these unsigned contracts and invoices to companies that didn't even have contracts, such as the Laundry Solutions and Capital Kitchen.
Right. On this note with the special powers, I had asked the governor yesterday during the press conference about her special powers and about Attorney John Brown's statement provided